So today we're talking all about saturation on transients. And we're going to show how saturating a transient early on in the effects chain can really help your compression job and your EQ job. Saturation can kind of be the secret weapon for transients, so let's dive into that. So snare drums are a perfect example of how saturation can do wonders. A lot of times when we're working with snares, it can be difficult to compress them. Even the fastest attack can shave off either too much or too little of the transient. The saturation can shave the transient in a much more gentle and pleasing way than a compressor. And even if it doesn't do the whole job, it can get it ready to hit the compressor and reduce that initial peak enough without losing the punch that we like from it. So this is true for all kinds of high transient instruments, but the snare is a great example, so that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to saturate the snare before it hits the compressor and see what we can come up with. So let's take a look at that. So take a listen to the snare in this song, and you'll hear the dynamics are kind of all over the place in the sense that the hits on the snare were not very even. To get all this under control with just a compressor can be very difficult, so this is a perfect example of what saturation can do for us. So let's take a listen to the dry snare in the mix. Yeah, you can hear how some of the hits are just way too quiet, and the initial crack of the transient is jumping right out of the mix. So the saturator on the snare is bypassed right now, and you can see on the loudness meter on the right, we're running it at about negative 29 LUFS, and our true peak is at about negative 9.5 dB. So the cool thing about saturation on the snare is we can get the true peak reduced, but actually have the snare sound louder. So when you shave off the transient with a saturator and you're saturating that transient with a little bit of slight distortion where you shave it, the added harmonics on the transient provide this effect where the transient sounds louder than it is. So when you saturate a transient, if you do it right, you can reduce your true peak on the meter here and take it down several dB, but it will actually sound louder. It's a perceived volume thing, and it's not something you could really duplicate with a compressor. So with the saturator bypass, we can see we're running negative 9.6, negative 9.7 true peak, and our LUFS, which is our integrated average volume, is at about negative 28, negative 29. Now let's engage the saturator. See, the snare actually sounds a little bit louder, but the true peak has decreased down to 14.3. So we've lost 5 dB in the peak, and the integrated LUFS is almost the same, but the snare sounds louder. Let me bypass it again for you. Back on. Off. On. Yeah, fantastic. So the saturation on the transient does that amazing thing where it can start to trim off the peak and clip it down a little bit, but because it's adding in harmonics, it gives us a perceived volume increase. So since we're able to reduce our true peak by 5 dB, we've essentially gained 5 dB of headroom in the snare, and that is crucial. That's getting us closer and closer to being able to achieve max loudness on our master bus. But now, if you oversaturate it, just like anything else, it'll start to distort too much, and it won't sound like a pleasant snare anymore. So let's go ahead and do that. Every saturator has a drive or an input gain. This one has an input gain. A lot of them say drive, but that's how hard you're slamming the signal into the saturator. The harder you push it in, the more saturation you get. And the clip ceiling, the more we decrease that, the more we're just shaving off the top of the transient, and you got to be real careful with that. But if we crush it down, that's atrocious. And now we back it off and we look for a sweet spot. But this is how you do it. You just dial it in too far, get it too crunchy, and then you pull it back and you look for a sweet spot. The loudness meter is very helpful because you can see if I bypass it, we were peaking at negative 9.7, and we bring it back on, and we're peaking at negative 14.5. And so the snare sounds louder, it sounds fuller. Now let's hear it in the mix. All right, we'll bypass it. Now, a lot of people will use a clipper instead of a saturator to get that initial transient under control, but if you've never tried this, I highly recommend it because I think the result is just way better. Turn the saturator back on. Isn't that awesome? The saturator is basically acting as EQ and compressor on the snare, and it's the only thing in the effects chain right now. So these high transient instruments really benefit from saturation early on in the effects chain. Having it before it even hits a compressor is really, really helpful. So that's the snare with the tube on it. Let's turn the tape on as well. All right, so there's nothing on this snare but tube saturation and tape saturation now. This is why anything more than super subtle, gentle saturation is best done in increments. Don't try to get it out of one instance of any plugin, and keep adding gentle saturation and layers to a sound until you get it where you need it to go. So here it is again. We'll turn both saturators off, and then we'll turn them both back on. Pretty awesome, huh? It sounds louder and it's actually quieter. The peak is more under control, but we haven't lost the punch and the crack of the transient that we need for it to carry through the mix. We haven't even had to put on a transient shaper to bring any of it back. And you can bring some of it back with the compressor too. So a slower attack time that's really gonna let all the transient through, and then you control the release to fatten up the snare. So your compression job has actually kind of changed character now. Now we're not trying to control that transient with the compressor. We're trying to let it through and just use the compressor to even out the signal. So let's listen again to both saturators on the snare, and then we'll turn the compressor on. All right, let's turn all three of them off and listen to it dry again. Back on. Awesome. That's a great sound. It's off to a good start, and we haven't even hit an EQ yet. And yeah, I don't really like the tone of the snare, but it sounds a lot better after it's been saturated with a little tape and a little tube, and the compressor is doing a great job here. Let's take a look. We're not even taking that much off with the threshold, and we're at a super gentle ratio. This compressor is not working hard at all. Let's turn it up a bit. Yeah, we're off to a great start with this snare. Saturation on transients before you even get into EQ and compression can be your best friend. It can make all the difference. And then now that we have it all smoothed out, we could go into EQ work and get it fitting into the mix the way we want, and then go down your effects chain from there. And I should also point out that this method could also benefit from an EQ before the saturator to do some high passing and maybe even some shaping EQ to get it ready to hit the saturator, but this totally illustrates the point. Saturating before compression is a really wonderful thing. Well, there you go. I hope that helps, and I hope you got a lot out of that. Hit me up in the comments and let me know what you think, and I'll catch you on the next one.